We're now going to turn to Lecture 7, Part 1, Globalization and Institutions. This will be a quick run through of what we're thinking about when we talk about globalization and the global institutions that have been designed and run over really since World War II has been the primary uh, introduction of global institutions to try to handle this. So, what is globalization? It is what it sounds like, the closer integration of all countries, given we have lower transportation and communication costs, and we've reduced human made barriers to trade. So, in other words, we're one global world, right? It's a small world after all kind of thing. And it has lots of dimensions, not just economics. We're talking about ideas, democracy, human rights, health and education, civil society. Economic integration is a big part of that because of trade and the ability to exchange goods and services. But the ability to exchange ideas, the ability to exchange what's moral, what's cultural, what's a social norm, um, is all part of globalization. And those who worry about nationalization are worried about the homogenizing of the world, or finding a McDonald's in Eastern Europe, or finding a Starbucks in China, right? This idea that it's just a global spread of the same companies everywhere around the world. Well, that's true. But now the question is, if people in countries outside the US want these companies, and it doesn't have to be just US companies, it could be any company, um, then what's wrong with it from an economic perspective? Because you are moving low valued uses to high valued uses. And economists, of course, advocate for that all the time. You may not like it because you think it's imposing our ideals on someone else, the westernization of the world. So that's an interesting question. I'm recording, so I'm going to close your door. All right. So it's worked great for some countries. East Asia has really seen big improvements in standards of living and reductions in poverty. Global trade, especially exports, international investments, new technologies. And they have also been closed off to speculative capital flows. So they have not really allowed people to just essentially speculate on the market. It's been very controlled. So there's been some curtailing of the downside risk and the upside risk, but more of a safe and steady approach to growth through globalization and trade liberalization. It hasn't worked that great for Latin America. Growth seems to have been cut in half from what it was in earlier decades. It seems that the top 1% of the income group just keep getting richer, and poverty has not gone down by as much as it should. Unemployment, inflation, there's been some real issues in terms of managing the economy in Latin America. And it could be for the same reason that companies are coming down there not to trade, but to exploit. And so there is some question about who's responsible, who's the culprit here in terms of globalization. Is it locals? Is it the people who are coming in, or is it some combination of the both? And if the 1% are just getting richer, chances are it's some combination of the both. So it's not really whether globalization is good or bad, but can we get globalization to work for us, especially for the poor? And can we make it fair in terms of equal opportunity? Maybe not in terms of equal outcomes, but that's another issue. And can we make globalization representative of more values in terms of things beyond just GDP? So the problem with globalization, as you can imagine, anytime anybody's expanding anywhere or you're working with other people, and you don't feel like you're getting a fair shake, is the game rigged? Are the institutions that govern globalization tilted towards the developed countries like the US for their own interests? Does globalization ignore market failures like climate change, air pollution, all the externalities of expanding the market? Is it too grandiose in the sense of is theory driving it rather than practical application? So, if we try to enforce a particular version of the free market economy on developing economies and nothing truly exists like we're trying to impose on a new system, it's kind of obvious that that system may or may not adjust rapidly. You're essentially trying to jumpstart the economy into this more Western world like they did when the Soviet Union broke up. And that didn't turn out the way we thought it would, and turned out to create a bunch of oligarchies in which a select number of people became incredibly rich based on support of the government as opposed to a democratic redistribution of wealth. And of course, there can be the idea of the ugly American in the sense of insufficient attention to the local culture and what makes the local culture work, rather than trying to just say the local culture is weird or etc. So the three big international economic institutions, World Trade Organization, World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And all three of these were really started to get going after World War II. And the World Trade Organization is really what it sounds like. Try to set up rules to govern international trade. If there's some dispute, you can go to the WTO. The World Bank is really responsible for giving out development assistance around the globe, especially to the poor countries, the developing countries in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. The International Monetary Fund is trying to keep the world financial system on an even playing field. So if there is some kind of corruption in a central bank in some country, the International Monetary Fund can't necessarily fix it, but they can adjust how they deal with that country relative to all other countries. And it can also loan money out to countries if there's some kind of boom and bust and there's a bust. Who runs the funds? Well, typically, as the IMF and the World Bank, is often run by the Western countries. I mean, the US is the only country with veto power. Both the World Bank and the IMF are located, their central locations in Washington, D.C. And so even though there may be World Bank offices around the world, around the planet, and IMF offices, the central power is in Washington, D.C. So it's not surprising that the U.S. has a big say on both the IMF and the World Bank and how things are operated. The WTO, this is supposed to be by consensus, one country, one vote. Again, the developed countries run the show, and I'm sure there's, you can imagine, a lot of closed door meetings, arm twisting, leverage, trying to say, well, you give me this, I'll give you that. And the transparency there maybe is an issue, but the big benefit is you have a place to go as opposed to just complaining. Now you can go to the WTO, whether you can get what you want if you're a smaller country in terms of renegotiating fair trade agreements, that's another story. But they are there, and each country is represented, but many countries really do have little voice in the story. So do they work? Yes and no. So on the pro side, we really have opened up international trade. And in many ways, we saw the data before that did uh, reduce poverty around the globe in many spots. Africa still has its challenges, but in especially Southeast Asia, things really improved a lot. Um, there's also been more opportunities for wages, and the question is a low paying job working for Nike exploitation, or is it relatively better than um, growing rice on a farm, being in agriculture? It depends, and it's nothing is as obvious as it seems. It would seem exploitation relative to our wages, but what is it relative to someone in Southeast Asia? Um, what's their next best alternative? So again, thinking about it in terms of relative prices, not absolute. What is your next best alternative? And in some arguments, that globalization has reduced a sense of isolation. We live in Wyoming. We're pretty isolated, but yet at the same time, we have connections with the globe through the internet, through what we're doing right now. And the same goes for around the world. Have they not worked? Yeah, and especially in terms of the inequality, the income distribution. Rich getting richer, poor getting poorer, or the rich are getting richer by more than the poor are getting richer. There is still that issue. Um, High expectations haven't been fulfilled. We talked about that in last with the bottom billion in terms of you've got bad institutions. It's really hard to make globalization work. Um, right? I mean, there are still millions of people throughout the developing world that are stuck in poverty. There's, still a chunk. And will eventually they come out? That's a good question. We don't know. We're trying to use globalization as a way to lift all boats. How long will that take? That's another story. All right, so obviously there's no easy answer. One size fits all doesn't really work, never has. Trying to fine tune um, globalization to the local economy in terms of setting things up, well, the Grameen Bank was one example of a bottoms up approach in which countries can experiment with alternatives. But the key is to get capital to them and make sure people have capital, that stock of assets, so they can generate a flow of income, right? And can we do that through globalization? And the argument is yeah, because you open up trade barriers, you open up ideas, you open up the notion of exchange. Once you open up the notion of exchange, it doesn't have to be goods and services. It can be ideas, it can be cultural norms. And as these things spread across the world, hopefully the good ones, the good, quote, good, unquote, ideas survive and the bad ones go away. But it's not like that happens overnight. So what went wrong with globalization from an economics perspective? From a cultural perspective, and we can talk about it too, but that's not my expertise. Thinking about it from an economic perspective, one challenge with globalization is that when we talk about globalizing with free trade, we're assuming markets around the world are just going to function perfectly, right? Low valued uses are going to go to high valued uses. No market failure. We're going to reduce risk and increase wealth for everybody, rich and poor. But when markets are breaking down due to poor property rights, or markets are breaking down due to externalities or lack of enforcement, or when people are assuming people know information when they don't, that there's asymmetric information, so you got moral hazard and adverse selection, you have some real challenges in these markets. And what we could see happening is instead of reducing risks and increasing wealth, rather we spread the risk across the globe to the poor and we concentrate the wealth with the rich, the ones who can protect themselves. And that's what has been transpiring for decades now. And if you're running globalization that way, well, yeah, of course, people are not going to be supporting globalization because if the rich get richer and you're just dumping the risk on the poor or the lower middle class, nobody's going to support globalization if that's your end result. So Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel laureate. I worked for him in the White House. He was my boss in the Council of Economic Advisors. Absolute brilliant man, very progressive, very left-leaning. He's a critic of the global institutions, and he argued that trade liberalization would actually lower the wage of the low-skilled workers based on some earlier economic work. And there is a couple links here to hear from him himself, but his main message is that if we got to globalize, that's going to happen. But if markets are not always efficient and stable, so in other words, there's market failure, you're going to need new rules to help guarantee shared prosperity. There's that term again when we talked about poverty and the sharing rule and who gets what based on trade. If you're not willing to share prosperity, then nobody's going to be willing to support globalization except for the extremely rich. And we're seeing what we see now in the U.S., which is an increase towards nationalization. And the U.S. is not an exception. It's happening all across Europe as well. People start looking inward when globalization is not giving them what they were promised. So here's a nice interview with him. You should read that. And then here is Stiglitz himself on a couple of short YouTube interviews as well. I mean, if you want to study Stiglitz, man, there are 1,000 Stiglitz YouTube videos ranging from 30 seconds to 3 hours. These two are relatively short, but you will get a feel for why Stiglitz is such an important economist even today when, his message is pretty simple. We're going to globalize, but you can't assume markets always work. And when they don't, you now push the risk on the poor and push the wealth to the top 1%. And if you don't have rules that guarantee some form of shared prosperity, globalization will have its critics, just like we witnessed in the 2016 election with the popularity of both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, both of them going against the Washington establishment of, all things are good, when in fact, what we're finding is that the people who are suffering the most premature deaths in the United States lately have been middle-aged, under no college white males. And that is a lot of the support for Trump is that group who feel left behind in this globalization effort. All right, we'll stop here and then we'll pick up again in part 2.